1940s had proved seminal for the development of modernity in Bengal. At this juncture, it becomes necessary or rather mandates to mention that there were a few artists who were not part of the Calcutta Progressive Group, but they worked independently, individually. And today they are well-known, established artists, some names to be reckoned with. These artists, they documented the famine, its heartlessness, its barbarity, and the deaths and the dyings, which they did so in their own personal language, which they had it embedded with their emotions, and documented the harshness of the whole, which had destroyed almost 3 million people. These artists were Chittaprasad Bhattacharya, Zainul Abedin, Govardhan Ash, Gopal Ghosh, and Somnath Hore. Their contributions remain significantly seminal in the development of modernity, a modernity which was more expressionistic than realistic or romantic. Chittaprasad Bhattacharya was a reformist activist artist. He grew up in a small village in 24 North Parganas in Bengal, and while studying at the university as a student in 1930, he became associated with the communist ideology and soon became a member of the Communist Party. He was rejected by Calcutta School of Art as well as by the Kala Bhavan Shantiniketan because of his political leanings. And so largely he was a self-taught artist, and since he was working with the Communist Party and its propaganda instruments, he had to create posters and various other mediums for the propagation of their ideals. So he decided that he would use the minimum element, and in this respect he just used line and a little exaggeration of forms. So his posters were well accepted by the group, communist group, and when the famine happened in 1943, he was sent out to document the famine as it had struck various places in Bengal. So he traveled across the region, particularly to the Midnapore area, and he documented all of these and created so many sketches and written texts that it ultimately resulted in a book known as the Hungry Bengal. Some 5,000 copies were made, but today only one copy survives. This was because of the fact that the Hungry Bengal gave a graphic, deadly representation of the famine, which was actually shameful for the colonial administration and the apathy of the local people, also the local businessmen, etc. And in order that it may not be known, all the copies were immediately seized and set on fire. So that is why nothing remains, but fortunately one copy of it remains of the Hungry Bengal. Chittaprasad, in his sketches, he made use of line, and he created works that were evocatively, poignantly powerful and emotionally moving. Just a line and the black ink that he used was so effective and so symbolic of the destruction of death, dying, starving, etc., that he had portrayed, and that exaggeration that he brought into his works was that of a hard-hitting socialist reality. And it is these works which made such an impact that it brought him fame. But then he had created these works not meant for a gallery, but they were meant for the masses. As a result, they were very loosely sketched, the forms were loosely drawn, but despite the fact that they were loosely drawn and the compositions were not tight or terse in the way generally a composition is made for a fine art painting, he did not do any of these things because for him it was the direct portrayal of the life that he was seeing around him, particularly those severely and strongly affected by the death, by the famine. So that is how Chitta Prasad created works which were actually also a satirical caricatures. In 1946, he moved to Bombay and soon realized that the ideology of the Communist Party was changing and that it was no longer in agreement with him. So he moved away from the party and he started his own individual art, where he collaborated with children's organization, creating platforms for showing puppetry, etc. And later on in his works, there is much of the prosperity of the city, of the children, of the humanity as such, which has been depicted. But today, if one thinks of Chitta Prasad Bhattacharya, it is his sketches of the caricatured, satirized, moving, poignant expressions of the death as he saw it in the Bengal famine. He always resisted the colonial administration as well as the hegemony of the landed gentry. And he, of course, never believed in the revivalist of the Bengal style. So in this respect, it was his personal vision. It was his visual language that arose out from within him on seeing the famine hit humanity that he saw lying around. So he remains the most important seminal figure in the development of modernity in Bengal. The other important artist was Zainul Abedin. Zainul Abedin studied at Calcutta School of Art, and once he finished his graduation, he was taken on as a teacher. But somehow he felt restless and he needed to look at the world around. So he left the job and he started traveling around. And in 1943, he started traveling and looking at the streets of Calcutta, where he saw the influx of all the refugees coming from different directions to find food in the city, and saw nothing but the starving, the dead and the dying all around. And he documented this. He documented this in 1943 by using or making his own black, using the lamp black, and used the ordinary paper of the packaging. The very fact that he used this ordinary material clearly showed that the aim was not to create any grandiosity of art, but it was mainly to document and, most importantly, to have it inherently subsumed with his emotions, as he was deeply affected by it. The works were shown in 1944 and immediately he attained critical acclaim. Zainul Abedin's work, in contrast or in opposition to Chitta Prasad, was that while Chitta Prasad had a tendency to create detailings and many choppy, strong lines, Zainul Abedin used a few strokes and gave the effect of an evocative form. And these evocative forms were quite monumental. Though they were small in size, the drawings were small in formats, but the forms he created had that kind of a monumentality of loss, of nostalgia, and of dead and the dying. And he portrayed this with a few simple strokes. And this is what made his works even more evocative, more provocative, very expressionistic. And with this deep concern for humanity, he was also able to imbue it with his own emotions. Later on, Zainul Abedin migrated to Chittagong, that's the place where he was born, and he helped in establishing an institution of arts and crafts that later became the university, an important department in the University of Dhaka. Zainul Abedin continued to work, and his works were almost always rooted in the life of the peasants, the laborers, etc. And that is how he continued to work till the end. He was, of course, celebrated and decorated with the highest national award by the Bangladesh government. He passed away in 1978. So here we have two artists who, with their own personal vision and their developed visual language, added and enhanced the modernity of Bengal. Govardhan Ash, who went off to his village He had also documented the Bengal famine. His famine had the monochrome of brown, and he used colors, and his works were created in watercolor technique, and they were equally powerful. His figures were emaciated, exaggerated, and the color strokes that he used in the background created the harsh imagery of the famine in which the human forms were located. And Govardhan Ash, from the beginning, had this deep concern. He was sensitive and had a deep concern for humanity, and could not develop much as there was not enough of the creative infrastructure at a time when he was working. So Govardhan Ash, with his rural setting and the landscape, created his famine series to be extremely expressionistic in the way he formed his figures that were harsh with strokes that only showed strident angles, and the colors in the background that were roughly worked on. Gopal Ghosh had studied both at Calcutta School and at the Madras School of Arts and Crafts. He also documented the famine series, and we find that in the works of Gopal Ghosh that the colors were strident, minimal greens, blues, yellows, and with the reductionist forms and technique, he created the effect of a famine by just showing a skeleton lying, which has been done in a few strokes of white. So Gopal Ghosh also added with his modernist vision of minimal forms and strident colors. Somnath Hore, of course, remains another very important figure. He also had witnessed a famine, had seen the heaps of corpses lying in the streets of Calcutta, and was deeply affected by it. He did paintings originally, and his most famous series translated as Wounds, something which remained inherently impressed in his heart and mind, and it literally conditioned his subject matter throughout his life. Later on, he did a few bronze sculptures which were on a very small scale, and it reflected the same. He moved on, of course, from the famine, death and dying to showing the life and poverty in the streets of Calcutta. But his most important series was, of course, that of the wounds, which were done in white, on a white handmade paper with impressions and a few blood stains here and there that were extremely poignant and reminder of the wounds suffered by the collective community itself. So in this way, these five artists seems to have made, or rather made, a significant contribution to the development of modernity.